important that in anchored. And of course, these disruptions associated with the war in the Ukraine, with the lockdowns in China that are going to disrupt supply, other supply disruptions, that's outside of the Fed's direct control. But that doesn't mean that the Fed shouldn't respond to it. People don't care what the source of the inflation is. When they see prices going up, they're going to demand higher wages. And if the Fed's not doing anything about it, they're going to say, the Fed doesn't care. And so I want even higher wages because inflation went from under 2 to 8, and it could go to 10.
Randy, how does the Fed thread the needle and go from maybe behind the curve, to use the cliche, to at least equal to where the curve should be? How do they do that without, as the yield curve is telling us, tipping the economy into a recession?
That's always the challenge, because of course they've got to rebuild credibility and make sure that it's not clear that they've lost credibility, maybe a little bit, but make sure not to lose it and build credibility. And saw in the late 70s, Paul Volcker had to raise rates very significantly, unfortunately tipping the economy into recession. I think with the combination of higher rates and with all the uncertainties of war and sanctions and weighing on investment, weighing on people's consumption, it's tough. And so I think the chance of us tipping into a recession is now reasonably high by the end of the year, beginning of next year.
Let's talk a little bit about the decision not to begin to reduce the Fed's balance sheet at this meeting. That sounds like it is over the next hill. How important is that in, number one, fighting inflation, reducing the amount of money that's in the system? And two, is that, I hesitate to use the word, a more humane way to practice monetary restraint than the more blunt instrument of raising interest rates?
Well, I think they both have to do with the amount of resources and reserves that are in the system, the amount of liquidity that's being put into the system. So they will work through similar means, and both will tighten credit conditions. So I think a reduction of the balance sheet would effectively be putting pressure on interest rates also. So I think the consequence is similar. I think what they wanted to do is start with something more traditional, 25 basis point increase, not a 50 basis point increase. They wanted to signal things are going to move in a direction towards trying to bring rates up. We still have to remember that inflation's at 8%. They expect to be at the end of this year at about 1.75%, 2%. That still means that the inflation-adjusted rate is negative 6%. That's still not very restrictive, but I think they need to do it, and I think they are on that path. And I think the balance sheet reduction will be a complement to that, but I think they're going to more have that in the background rather than use that as a primary tool.
A couple of our guests, Randy, were skeptical that the Fed would indeed raise interest rates 7 times and continue those hikes into 2023. Do you have any reason to be skeptical of that?
Well, certainly we don't know exactly where the economy is going to go. We don't fully understand the consequences of the war or what could happen. There could be very dire consequences for the global economy, or we could get a relatively quick resolution. Very hard to predict. And so if there were more dire consequences, it would have inflationary or deflationary effects. The Fed would take that into account. But I think, remember, as I said, inflation rate's 8%. They're only raising rates to 2%. Back in the 1970s, the inflation rate was in similar range, and Volcker was raising rates to double-digit levels.
Randy, what do you say to those who argue, and we heard this a little bit from Senator Warren last hour, that this is mostly just a pandemic phenomenon? I think she primarily attributed it to that, and then also said it was because corporations have too much market power and are raising prices beyond the level that the market is requiring them to.
It's really hard to see that there's been a dramatic change in market power over the last two to 3 years. So it's hard to say that suddenly corporations have become very powerful, and they weren't that powerful before. Because remember, we had a decade of, well, in post-financial crisis, more than a decade of very low inflation rather than high inflation. So it stretches credulity to think that there's been this sudden change in market power. There are a lot of sources for the high inflation. Some of them have to do with the pandemic. Some of them have to do with the responses to the pandemic, like the large amounts of stimulus that were provided. I think that's one of the reasons why inflation is a bit higher in the U.S. than it is in other countries, because we provided more government spending and more stimulus. The initial response was very important globally, and so I don't want to suggest that that was inappropriate. I have more questions about some of the subsequent sending out of checks to people, and that then leads to people having ability to spend and a lot of pent up demand because they've been cooped up for a couple of years. So some supply things, some demand things, not all the Fed's doing, some perhaps the Fed's doing. But as I said, no matter whether it's the Fed's doing or not, it's the Fed's issue because it's about inflation and inflation expectations. And they have to worry about where inflation expectations are going to go, because otherwise it becomes much more painful. I know people want to wait, but it's very risky to wait because it could be much more painful if you wait and inflation gets out of control and inflation expectations get out of control.
It's a great point, Randy, and perhaps we can even show some of the inflation break-evens that we do track here. We really appreciate your time today, your thoroughness. Thanks for joining us.
It was great to be with you.
Randy Koszner with the Dow. Tyler, now down about 19 points.
Yeah, I'm thinking of the famous Howard Cosell called "Down Goes Frazier, Down Goes Frazier." And I know what lots of people are thinking, who was Howard Cosell? Because he was from way back when. But down goes the Dow, as we saw. Who was Frazier? Down goes the Dow, as we saw there, as the Fed came out with what I think is being interpreted as a much more aggressive targeting of high inflation. We are at a generational moment, I believe, Kelly. We haven't seen inflation this high, this persistent since the early 80s, when the Fed chair at that time, Paul Volcker, came out with a bazooka and went after it. Fed Chair Jay Powell is now in a position where he is having, and forgive me for using these wartime metaphors, but he is using sort of heavy artillery to target inflation.
Yes, and again, we're showing there the 5-year, 10-year spread, not of dramatic market significance, but it is negative for the first time in a couple of years. We also showed the 10-year break-evens a moment ago, and we are seeing that's inflation expectations in the market. They have come down. Of course, that is going to have to be a goal of the Fed's, given just how high they've gone. For example, on the 5-year break-evens, we were at 3.4% yesterday. That's the market's expected annual inflation rate, up from about 3% turn of the year.